A few months ago, an event occurred that became the beginning of some changes in my life, and subsequently, I began to look at the world and relate to people differently. One day, a colleague invited me to meet at a cafe to discuss some details of our joint project. He had a brilliant idea and was eager to share it with me. Harry and I had been working on the layout of a future recreational park, which the director wanted to build where an old church had once been destroyed, now a vacant lot frequented by the homeless and alcoholics. The area wasn't very big, but there was still room to build something worthwhile there, so we put forward our own version of the project. Harry pulled out his laptop, searched through it for a bit, then turned the screen towards me, displaying several intricate building designs, along with some small squares featuring fountains and a children's playground. "I think this will look absolutely splendid. Plus, everything is quite compact and convenient to visit any leisure spot, whether it's a cafe with ice cream or a smoking area. What do you say?" Harry said. I carefully examined every detail in line. At first glance, the layout seemed quite comfortable. "I'm not sure. It looks good, but don't you think our contractors might struggle to bring all these fancy features on the buildings to life? Besides, considering everything, this place will significantly stand out in the city," I replied after some consideration. "What? That's the whole point. We just need to find a good engineer who can figure out how to assemble all the details." "Well, it's not entirely our task. But I see it this way, as another step towards the future." Harry praised his idea as if it were a masterpiece among constructions. In the end, I supported his idea, and the next morning we were preparing to present the project to the management. After dinner with him, I headed home. But on the way back, for some reason, I wanted to stop by that vacant lot and see it once more before significant changes began. By that time, the homeless people had been dispersed, and some construction materials had been brought in. In one corner, there was a small booth where a guard stood watch at night. He was slightly surprised by my late visit, and I told him I just wanted to take another look around. For about half an hour, I wandered through the lot, various thoughts swirling in my mind. Somehow, I felt that there shouldn't be any entertainment complexes in that place. If it were up to me, I would have restored what was there before. I believe that such a place should have a church, not something else. But my boss had his own views, and I was just doing my job, following his orders. As I was about to leave, my wife called, asking me to pick her up from her yoga class as she was having car trouble. This news didn't exactly thrill me, as I was already tired from a full day's work, and after the meeting with my colleague, I just wanted to relax even more. Initially, I wanted to tell Jody to take a taxi, but I eventually gave in to her persuasion and drove halfway across town to pick her up. It was quite dark outside, and I tried to park the car not too far away. The street seemed quite deserted, as if everyone had vanished in an instant. Instinctively, I glanced around and headed towards the building. Walking along the empty road, I thought I heard something, although until then, I had only heard my own footsteps echoing in the semi-darkness. I looked around again but saw no one. However, as soon as I took 2 more steps, I heard a crackle not far from the trash container. My first thought was that it could have been just an opossum, but when I stopped, dead silence prevailed. So, I decided to check as a robber could be hiding behind the dumpster. Despite my age, I was in fairly good physical shape and was confident I could handle a shady thief unless they were a martial arts champion. Quietly approaching the dumpster, I immediately dove behind it and tackled the person hiding there. Pinning them down, I could see under the streetlight that it wasn't a homeless person or a typical criminal. I grabbed hold, pressed my knee against their chest, and tightened my grip on their throat so they couldn't wriggle free. "Who are you? And why are you following me?" I demanded, noticing a camera hanging around his neck. "Let me go," he croaked. "You're of no concern. I'm a private detective, on a case here. If you release me, I can show you my credentials." I loosened my grip slightly, allowing him to reach into his inner pocket. He handed me his wallet, and I quickly checked his identification. Will Forrest, the detective, proved to be who he claimed. I released him and began questioning who he was actually pursuing here. However, he started refusing to answer, citing it as a confidential investigation and wouldn't reveal the suspect. I took his word for it, understanding that everyone was just doing their job and didn't detain him further. Will headed to his car, and I went to meet my wife. Jody looked a bit weary but greeted me fairly warmly. I intended to ask her how her day went, but she beat me to it, bombarding me with questions. She then explained that her car had stalled just a couple of 100 meters from the parking lot, forcing her to walk the rest of the way. "Did you call for a tow service?" I asked. "When I was already late for class. I couldn't just sit there waiting for them to decide to show up. And besides, I've been saying for ages that it needs to be scrapped and replaced. Jody, I understand you want a new car, but you know we can't afford that right now. Your car is perfectly fine. You just needed to have it taken to the mechanics earlier, as I mentioned. Now you might even get a fine for leaving it wherever you did. Let's go, check if the car is still there, and call the necessary services." I loved my wife, but sometimes she overstepped, especially recently, often pressing me to spend money on her wardrobe, jewelry, or cosmetics. This sometimes led to minor arguments. Initially, I thought she was trying to compensate for our daughter Phoebe moving away to study in another state. But strangely, Jody hardly ever mentioned our daughter's name or expressed missing her, instead focusing solely on herself. And now, this unreasonable choice regarding some silly activity. We went to the spot she indicated, only to find the car gone. Apparently, it had been towed. I voiced my opinion, and she tried to portray herself as a victim again, saying I didn't pay her enough attention. But that evening, I was truly exhausted, and I didn't even want to argue with her. We just headed home. The next day, Harry and I presented our project to the manager. After a brief review, he approved it and assigned us a few more tasks. I had to meet with one of the engineers, considered one of the best, but it meant I needed to travel to another state for a couple of days. Harry was tasked with finding contractors for the initial construction. I wanted to ask my boss why he didn't send Harry on the business trip, but he never deviated from his decisions, so I decided not to waste time on that. During my lunch break, I had to deal with my wife's car, and there I met a friend who was also caught up in some situation and was due to meet with an investigator. We didn't talk for long as I was rushing back to work, agreeing to meet in the evening at a pub to chat. As I left the premises, I noticed the same detective I'd seen the previous evening. He saw me too, sitting in his car, staring intently at the entrance. I wanted to approach him, but apparently, he didn't want any more encounters with me and immediately drove off. It struck me as a bit odd that I'd encountered him twice in such a short span. But I didn't have time to chase after him, so I carried on with my tasks. In the evening, when I returned from work, my wife was at home. It was one of those rare evenings lately when she hadn't gone anywhere and I could enjoy some time with her. But I had already arranged to meet a friend and was getting ready for that. "And how long will you be gone?" she asked when I shared with her the upcoming business trip during my preparations. "A couple of days. Maximum 3. But I don't understand why you're so concerned. You always find something to do." "I was just asking." "I'll invite Hillary then. We'll have wine together. It's been a while since I had a girls' night." "Oh, thanks for the car, by the way. I had to take a taxi today. But still, think about replacing it." "Jody, I've told you several times I'm not a millionaire. If you want a car, get a job and earn it. You know I'm more concerned about our daughter's education right now. Plus, there are plenty of other expenses I have to cover." "You're just stingy," she huffed, switching on the TV and staring at the screen. The next words of mine about the need to be a little more prudent and serious, she didn't hear anymore. Realizing that it was pointless to continue talking to her, I went to meet a friend. He was already there when I arrived and had managed to have a few drinks. I quickly found him at the bar and sat down next to him. He shared with me his story that he had recently been in a minor accident when returning from a meeting with his girlfriend. I always wondered how he, being married, could have a mistress. I myself never recognized cheating in a relationship. I considered it a low and treacherous act. But even when I sometimes advised him to get smart, he never listened to me and said that it was his life and I had no right to tell him what to do. However, I didn't end my friendship with him because we had been friends for many years, since college, and over the years, there had been many situations where we seriously helped each other. I simply started asking who his latest puppet was. But Ed never confessed to me who she was. Rather, he described his meetings with her, how she was in bed, and much more. But for some reason, he kept her appearance or her name a secret. And according to his words, he had started seeing her quite recently and he didn't know how long their relationship would last because this lady was financially demanding and often asked him for expensive purchases. After a while, I went outside for a smoke, to get some fresh air and give my ears a break from the annoying music and bar noise. Stepping a bit further away from the building, I took a few puffs and just looked around, sometimes at the night sky. And then my gaze accidentally fell on a car that was familiar to me. I looked closer. It was definitely the detective's car. But he wasn't visible. Still, I approached closer and hid behind a corner, deciding to ambush him. I didn't know how long I'd have to wait, but curiosity got the better of me and I remained hidden. Luckily, I didn't have to wait long. I don't know where he had been, but soon I saw him returning to the car, and as he came close, I pounced on him and pinned him to the car. "It's you again. Just don't tell me you're not following me again. Speak, who hired you?" I held him by the collar and prepared to strike. "Damn, let me go. I told you I'm not following you. A woman hired me to follow her husband." "Who?" I asked again. The detective only muttered something about confidentiality, but I didn't believe him anymore. It seemed to me that he was definitely following me, and judging by his words, maybe my wife had hired him. Now I understood why she needed so much money lately. But why, since I hadn't given her any reason? What was she trying to prove with this? On the detective's neck, I noticed the camera again, and this time, I grabbed it and tore it off his neck. Will tried to take it back, but only received a strong blow from me, and while he was regaining his senses, I started scrolling through the pictures on the camera. I wanted to make sure that if there were photos of me, then he was definitely following me. And now, without answers, I wouldn't just let him go. However, I didn't see myself there. The last photos captured Ed. So, his wife hired the detective. And now I was curious about who my sinful friend was meeting that it had come to this. As I scrolled further, I was shocked because in the following photos, I saw him meeting with my wife, not only in a cafe but also in a motel and in a car outside the city. I couldn't believe my eyes. And then I pressed the detective again and demanded that he tell me everything, telling him that my wife was in the photos. Will said he knew who she was, which is why he tried to avoid meeting me. But it was really Ed's wife who hired him, as she had long suspected him of cheating and now wanted to divorce him and, according to the prenuptial agreement, leave Ed with nothing. I wanted to hit him, but I realized he was not to blame. He was just doing his job. I let him go but kept the camera. Returning to the bar, I walked towards Ed, filled with anger and rage. Now I understood why he had kept his lover's name hidden from me and intended to have a different conversation with him. Approaching Ed, without unnecessary words, I simply grabbed him by the collar from behind, pulled him towards me a little, then forcefully slammed his face onto the bar counter, causing dishes to scatter in different directions. But I didn't stop there. I repeated this action a couple more times. And when blood started trickling down his arrogant face, I pushed him and he managed to turn. "Hey, what's wrong with you? Have you gone crazy?" he asked, barely standing. "Oh, you jerk. How dare you sleep with my wife?" I replied and struck him again. As the fight started, bar customers intervened. Two of them even tried to grab and restrain me, but my rage was so intense at that moment that I easily pushed them away and continued attacking Ed. Within a minute, he was completely covered in blood, trying to shout something in response. But I wasn't listening. I wasn't listening to anyone. I had enough proof that he betrayed me. Only when the bartender yelled about calling the police did I stop. I didn't want to end up behind bars, especially since I had a business trip the next day. Leaving the bar, I immediately drove away and headed home. I knew Ed wouldn't file a complaint against me since he was at fault. But now I needed to sort things out with my wife. I entered the house, loudly kicking the door open. Jody was sitting on the couch watching TV. But when she heard me and then saw my fierce expression, she became flustered. "Hey, what's wrong?" she asked, startled. But she didn't know yet that I knew everything. Just like before, she began to play the innocent lamb. "Oh, you scum! How could you?" I approached her and grabbed her by the hair. "I do everything for you, earn money for your clothes, even allow you not to go to work, and you, damn you, what was lacking for you? Decided to betray me? Especially with my friend? What are you talking about? Let me go. It hurts." She whimpered. "Oh, it hurts for you. What about me? I loved you. And you just crushed my feelings." I forcefully pushed her and she fell on the couch. I took a camera from my pocket and threw it at her. "What's this?" she asked. I gave her some time to look at the evidence of her infidelity, and with each picture, her eyes widened, fear evident on her face. When she realized there was no escaping an explanation, Jody tried to prove her innocence again. But it didn't affect me anymore. On the contrary, I became even angrier, couldn't bear it, and gave her a few slaps when she tried to approach me and say again that she wasn't guilty. At that moment, she was so repulsive to me that I didn't even want to see her. I went to the bedroom and immediately started packing my suitcase. When I finished and returned to the living room, Jody was sitting there, crying over those photos. I took the camera from her, then told her to start packing her things. I demanded that until I returned from the business trip, she wouldn't be seen or heard in the house. That night, I went to stay in a hotel and from there to the airport. Of course, I wanted to meet Ed again and continue dealing with him. But I didn't have time for that now. I knew he wouldn't go anywhere anyway, and I had to do my job. The next morning, I was already on a plane, trying to focus on the upcoming meeting. But to my dismay, the image of my wife being intimate with my friend was playing before my eyes, and I couldn't concentrate. Upon arriving, I gathered myself and went to the meeting my boss had arranged with engineer Roger Mordecai. His office looked quite remarkable. I'd even say he liked to flaunt his wealth. He invited me to sit down, and as I placed my ass in the leather chair, I didn't hesitate and pulled a laptop out of my briefcase, as well as some blueprints for a future project. While we talked and I briefed him on the details, I noticed a framed photo on his desk. It was him and Ed. It struck me as very odd, and I couldn't resist asking Roger about the photo. "Oh, that's my son, Ed. We rarely see each other. I keep his photo here." "Why do you see each other rarely?" "It so happened that I've been divorced from his mother for a long time. Now I have another family, but I still love that rascal. Too bad he refused to follow in my footsteps." "But did you fly here to ask about my family?" "Oh no. I'm sorry. I just felt like I knew him." We continued our conversation, already more to the point. I didn't want to tell him that his son is sleeping with my wife, but the fact that they're relatives now couldn't leave my mind. Over the next 2 days, I met with Roger a few more times, discussing the project. And when the business negotiations were over, I started getting ready to go home. I wasn't eager to return there and hoping that Jody would follow my orders and leave home before I arrived. But as I entered the house, I noticed that my wife was still there. Her things remained in place and the familiar aroma of her cooking drifted from the kitchen. Before I could even step into the room, Jody came out to meet me. "Eric, listen. I feel so guilty before you. Please forgive me. Everyone makes mistakes. I love you." She tried to approach and hug me, but I just pushed her away and went into the room. "I told you to leave. Why are you still here?" I asked, placing my briefcase down and sitting on the couch. Jody began her pleading speech again, asking for my forgiveness and expressing remorse for her actions. Over these 3 days, I had cooled down a bit and could speak with her more calmly. But I didn't feel like it yet, so I asked her to leave me alone. My wife went back to I remembered that Ed and Roger were related. Yes, I had noticed from the very beginning that they had the same last name, but I couldn't have guessed such a thing. Now I was even curious why Ed never told me about his father. He rarely spoke about his family in general. I didn't have to go to work that day, so I allowed myself a drink. Pouring some whiskey into a glass and taking a few sips, I went to the kitchen where Jody was sitting at the table, scrolling through something on her phone, humming a tune to herself. When I entered, she immediately set aside the gadget and looked at me with an innocent gaze, hoping for a conversation between us. I sat across from her and started talking. "Tell me, Jody, you understand our marriage is over anyway. But I want to know, why did you do this? Why did you sleep with my friend? What did I do to deserve this?" "Well then," Jody put on a more serious face. "If you're so curious, know this. You're to blame. I've asked you so many times to buy me a car or that necklace I liked, but you just hoarded your money as if I'm just a housekeeper to you. And you know how hard it is to keep the house in order, don't you? I'm tired of it. I wanted some entertainment, something new." "New entertainment? Wasn't all that enough for you? Clubs, yoga, friends. Not enough for you?" I started feeling my anger resurfacing. Her accusations seemed audacious to me and angered me again. "You live much better than many of your friends. You're just a slut." I stood up from the table and paced around the kitchen. "But Eric, I'm telling you the truth. And Ed, he's a rich daddy's boy, as it turns out. Didn't you know? But I found out, and I just wanted him to share some of his money with me. You fucking fucked him. Doesn't that mean anything to you? You betrayed our marriage. Years of our life. I felt the urge to slap her across her audacious face again, but I knew it wouldn't help. I returned to the living room because I didn't want to talk to my wife anymore, but now I wanted to meet Ed again. I didn't know what to do next because his father was coming to our town soon, and if he found out I had beaten his son to near death, he might refuse to cooperate with our company. But I couldn't just forget everything and leave it as it was. I wanted to somehow get back at this traitor who had eyes for my wife and, as it turned out, had been a liar all his life. Even what he said about working in some high position at a firm turned out to be false. His father let slip that Ed didn't inherit a good mind and mostly scraped by with odd jobs, and the main income in his family came from his wife's company. So much deceit around that it disgusted me. Emotions had built up so much inside me that I decided to go and look for Ed. At that moment, I didn't care how things would turn out. I just wanted justice for the betrayer. I didn't have to search long for Ed. First, I went to the place he said he worked, but as it turned out, they had kept him as a loader for several months, and he hadn't shown up for work the last week. So, I went to his home. I knew that if I called him, he wouldn't agree to meet and would run off somewhere else. As I suspected, Ed was indeed home. When I rang the doorbell and he opened it, he immediately tried to shut it again. However, I extended my foot, preventing the door from closing, and then forcefully pushed it open. "Listen, Eric. Let's talk," he began, stepping back. "We'll talk now," I kept pushing on, and soon we were in his living room. During this time, I noticed that his wife wasn't home yet. Apparently, she was still at work. Ed being alone at home allowed me to speak more freely with him. I swung and landed another blow on his barely healed facial wounds. Ed winced in pain but prepared to defend himself. However, I simply sat down on a chair and stared at him. "So, Ed, now tell me, why did you have an affair with my wife behind my back? We were friends, after all. What made you treat me this way?" I asked in a calm and steady tone. It even surprised Ed a bit, and he decided to respond. "Eric, listen. It just happened. We ended up at the same party, and things just unfolded. But I swear to you, she came on to me. I just didn't want to tell you to avoid upsetting you. But I was going to break it off with her. I swear," he explained. "And you think I'll believe you? Well, I don't know why she approached me. Maybe just because I'm charming. And what about your father? Your biological father?" Ed lowered his head in contemplation. Apparently, he realized that Jody was with him only for the money. It turned out that at a party, he got drunk and accidentally mentioned his father's financial status to her. But now he told me that he wouldn't inherit anything, as his father had long ago disowned him and his mother. His answer didn't convince me, although I got some answers to my questions. I stood up again and approached him. I was ready to punch him again. I even made a motion, but I was interrupted. At that moment, his wife returned home and, seeing me in an aggressive state, immediately bombarded me with questions. I didn't take a long time to explain to her why I had come to their house, and just handed her the camera I had brought with me. And then I briefly told her what I knew about the detective, and the pictures were what she expected in the show. Then I walked out of their house. I was still sitting in the car for a while, and I could hear the scandal his wife had given Ed. A couple of days later, Roger Mordecai visited our company. He was ready to start working, but also intended to visit his son. The next day, I saw him in the office, looking quite distressed, and asked what had happened, choosing a moment when we stepped out to the smoking area with cups of coffee from our machine. Roger shared with me what he had learned about his son's divorce, and the reason for the divorce. But he still didn't seem to know who had painted Ed's face like that. And if he did, he didn't tell me. I told him that my family wasn't doing well either, and that in my opinion it happened to people because they didn't appreciate what they already had, because what they already had could be much more valuable than money or gold. Then, for some reason, I shared my preference for construction with him and told him what I would actually like to see there. I didn't think this idea would strike a chord with him. But instead of ignoring me, as he was promised a huge sum for the park, Roger asked me to elaborate further on my desire. While we smoked, I verbally described the project to him, and when we returned to the office, I even showed him the presumed layout on my laptop, which I had been working on at home in my spare time, just for myself. A week passed. I divorced Jody. I left her only with a one-room apartment that looked more like a homeless shelter, and I froze her bank account. Now she will have to get a job and earn money for herself. She cursed me for a long time for my actions, but I wanted to punish her somehow for not valuing our relationship and betraying my love. And also, to my surprise, when I came to the office and prepared for another workday, a colleague approached me and said that the boss was in a frenzy. Then he explained that Roger Mordecai had decided to buy that plot of land and build a church there, as was appropriate. He wasn't particularly religious himself, he just thought it was the right thing to do and that it could somehow atone for his son's sins. Story 2. We first met when we were both about 4 years old. And I am somewhat proud of that, because it is very rare to find people who have managed to find their first love at such an early age, let alone keep it. That girl's name was Holly. Our meeting with her was absolutely deliberate because the meeting had been carefully planned by our parents. My mother, who moved to another city for work, decided that I, her dear heir, need a process of socialization. However, this need arises in all children. So not even 2 days after we moved in, my mother started dragging me around the local playgrounds. Unfortunately, our neighborhood was not too prosperous, so there were not so many children. However, my mother was still able to accomplish her goal. She developed a very good rapport with our neighbors, who were in the next house after ours. Their family was very ordinary and unremarkable. The father worked in the local clerk's office and the mother was a real estate broker. The greatest of people, it would seem. Therefore, I sincerely resented wherein their family could get such a bright and extraordinary girl. When I first saw Holly, I realized even then, in my 4 years, that there may not be a better option. I was finally convinced of my thought when we began to study together in the same class. Unlike most kids, she always stood out for her intelligence quotient. Holly could easily solve complex math equations, write fascinating stories, and draw beautiful pictures. I could watch her from the sidelines. And most importantly, she let me do it. For many years, best friend status was maintained between us. I was almost the only boy with whom she could share all her worries. The other boys didn't see her uniqueness, so they treated her rather mediocrely. I was different. I treated our friendship very thoughtfully. Our buddy relationship continued for many more years. It was only in middle school that puberty started to set in. That's when I realized that I needed a heart-to-heart relationship much more than a friendship. So I promptly confessed my feelings. Fortunately, my attempt was not a failure because Holly happily agreed to be my girlfriend. Our relationship began to grow rapidly. I learned to be more gallant, tried to do for her nice gifts. There were almost never any quarrels between us, so even my head was visited by thoughts about the prospects of our further relationship. I did not need to look for some girl. Next to me there was always So, who knew absolutely everything about my habits, interests, fears, character. I love you, Holly. I first uttered those words when I was about 14 full years old. I love you too. Let's promise that we'll always love each other, and in a few years you and I will be married. Let's do it. Of course.